The Farmer and the Well. Welcome to the story of the farmer and the well. This is a tale about a farmer who faces a difficult problem with his well and learns important lessons about hard work and perseverance. This is a perfect way to practice your English listening skills. Hello everyone. Welcome to our video on the farmer and the well story. Today, we will learn about a farmer who faced a difficult situation with his well. This story teaches us an important lesson about hard work, problem solving, and how we deal with challenges. So, are you ready to learn the full story of the farmer and the well? Let's watch together. Chapter 1. The Thomas of Life. Thomas was a kind farmer. He lived in a small, peaceful village. Thomas loved his work. He worked hard every day on his small farm. He always smiled and helped his neighbors. Thomas's farm was not very big, but it was beautiful. He grew tomatoes, corn, and carrots. His fields were green and full of life. He had a small house near the fields. It was cozy and warm, with flowers outside the door. Water was very important to Thomas. Without water, his plants could not grow. If his plants didn't grow, Thomas would have no food to eat or sell. He knew water was the key to farming. In the village, there was an old well. The villagers built it many years ago. It was made of stone and had a wooden bucket with a long rope. This well was the only source of water for the farmers. The farmers in the village shared the well. They were careful not to waste water. Each farmer took turns filling their buckets. Everyone worked together and helped each other. The village was full of kindness and cooperation. Chapter 2. The Problem. A Dry Spell. One summer, the weather began to change. The sun shone every day, and the sky stayed clear. At first, everyone enjoyed the sunny weather. But soon, the days became hotter and hotter. Weeks passed, and not a single drop of rain fell. The wind was warm, and the air felt dry. The clouds disappeared, and the village felt hotter every day. The farmers looked at the sky, hoping for rain, but it never came. Without rain, the ground started to change. It became dry and hard. Cracks appeared in the soil. Plants that once stood tall and green began to wilt. Their leaves drooped, and their colors faded. Thomas looked at his crops and felt worried. The tomatoes were small and shriveled. The corn was not growing tall, and the carrots were weak. The plants needed water, but there was not enough. The village well was the farmer's only source of water. Every morning, the farmers went to the well to pull up water. But as the dry days continued, the water level in the well began to drop. One morning, when Thomas lowered the bucket into the well, it made a strange sound. It hit the bottom of the well too quickly. Thomas pulled up the bucket and saw only a small amount of water. Each day, the bucket brought up less and less water. The farmers had to wait longer and work harder to fill their buckets. They started to wonder how long the well would last. The farmers gathered in the village square. They talked about the dry weather and the low water in the well. Their faces were full of worry. "What will happen if the well runs dry?" asked one farmer. "We need rain soon, or our crops will die," said another. The farmers shared their fears, but no one had a solution. They all looked at the sky, hoping for clouds, but the sun continued to shine. Thomas was more worried than anyone. He loved his small farm. He worked hard every day to take care of his plants. He knew that without water, his farm would not survive. Each morning, Thomas walked to the well and checked the water. He looked inside and saw the water level dropping. He felt a heavy weight in his chest. What would he do if there was no water? At night, Thomas lay in bed, unable to sleep. He thought about his farm, his crops, and his future. He wanted to find a way to save his plants. One morning, Thomas had an idea. What if I go to the well before anyone else? He thought. If I am the first one there, I can take more water for my farm. Thomas felt a little guilty for thinking this way. He knew the water was for everyone, but the thought stayed in his mind. He tried to push it away, but it kept coming back. Thomas told himself, I am only trying to save my farm. It's not wrong to take a little extra water. He decided to wake up early the next day and go to the well before anyone else. Chapter 3. Thomas's selfish decision. One morning, Thomas woke up very early. The sky was still dark, and the stars were shining. The village was quiet, and no one else was awake. Thomas felt a little ashamed, but he reminded himself why he was doing this. I need more water for my farm, he thought. If I wait, there may not be enough for my plants. Thomas grabbed his empty buckets and walked to the well. He walked quickly, hoping no one would see him. When Thomas reached the well, everything was silent. The air was cool, and the ground was wet with dew. The old stone well looked calm in the moonlight. Thomas lowered the wooden bucket into the well and pulled it back up, full of water. He poured the water into his buckets and repeated the process until both buckets were full. As he carried the heavy buckets back to his farm, Thomas felt a little guilty. Maybe I shouldn't take so much water, he thought, but then he told himself, I'm just doing what I need to do for my crops. As Thomas walked back to his farm, the sun started to rise. The sky turned orange and pink. Suddenly, he saw someone walking towards the well. It was George, another farmer. George looked surprised to see Thomas. Good morning, Thomas, George said. You're out very early today. Thomas felt nervous. Oh, yes, he said quickly. I couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd get some water early. George smiled politely, but he looked a little disappointed. He walked past Thomas and went to the well. Thomas hurried back to his farm, feeling uncomfortable. The next morning, Thomas woke up early again. He went to the well before sunrise and filled his buckets with water. He tried not to think about the other farmers. For the next few days, Thomas continued this routine. He woke up early, went to the well, and avoided meeting anyone. Each time he saw another farmer, he made a quick excuse and walked away. But the more Thomas did this, the more uncomfortable he felt. He missed the friendly conversations he used to have with the other farmers. Now, he felt lonely and ashamed. The other farmers began to notice that Thomas was always the first one at the well. They started to talk among themselves. Have you noticed that Thomas is always at the well before us? One farmer asked. Yes, said another. It seems like he's taking more than his share of the water. The farmers felt frustrated. They depended on the well to water their crops, but now it seemed like Thomas was getting more water than anyone else. Martha, a wise and kind farmer, noticed the worried looks on the other farmers' faces. She also noticed Thomas's behavior. Martha thought to herself, Thomas is a good man. Something must be wrong for him to act this way. She decided to talk to Thomas and find out what was going on. Martha believed that being honest and kind was the best way to solve problems. One evening, as the sun was setting, Martha visited Thomas's farm. She found him watering his plants. Good evening, Thomas, Martha said with a smile. Good evening, Martha, Thomas replied, trying to sound cheerful. Martha looked at him kindly. Thomas, she said, I've noticed that you've been going to the well very early. The other farmers are starting to feel upset. Is everything okay? Thomas felt cornered. He didn't know what to say. Oh, I've been waking up early lately, he said. I thought it would be a good time to get water. Martha looked at Thomas with knowing eyes. She didn't want to make him feel bad, but she also wanted him to understand. Thomas, she said gently, we all depend on the well. If one of us takes too much, it affects everyone else. We need to share, just like we always have." Thomas nodded slowly. He didn't say much, but Martha's words stayed in his mind long after she left. Chapter 4. The Consequences of Selfishness. Thomas kept waking up early to take water from the well. Because of this, the other farmers had less water for their farms. The plants on their farms began to suffer. The leaves turned yellow, and the crops drooped in the hot sun. Some plants even died. "This is not enough water for our farms," one farmer said. "How can we grow food like this?" The farmers tried to work harder to save their crops, but the dry ground made it very difficult. As the days passed, the farmers grew angry with Thomas. They noticed he was always at the well first and seemed to take more than his share of the water. "Thomas only thinks about himself," another farmer said. "He doesn't care about the rest of us." The friendly atmosphere in the village began to change. The farmers stopped smiling and talking to Thomas. They were too upset. Thomas noticed this. When he passed by the other farmers, they barely greeted him. It made him feel bad, but he didn't know how to fix the situation. Even though Thomas had enough water for his farm, he was not happy. Before, the other farmers would stop by his farm to chat or offer help. They would share advice or lend tools when he needed them. Now, no one came by. Thomas felt very lonely. He missed hearing the laughter of his neighbors and the friendly conversations they used to have. He tried to talk to the farmers, but they only gave short answers and walked away quickly. Thomas had hoped that getting more water would help his crops grow better, but to his surprise, his plants didn't look as good as he expected. He was tired from waking up so early every morning. Because of this, he didn't take care of his crops as carefully as he usually did. Also, the guilt and worry about what the other farmers thought of him made it hard for him to focus on his work. His crops grew, but not as well as he had hoped. He began to wonder if all his effort was worth it. One morning, Thomas noticed that one of his cows was not eating. The cow lay on the ground and looked weak. Thomas didn't know what to do. He had never dealt with a sick cow before. In the past, he could have asked the other farmers for advice. They would have come to his farm to help and suggest remedies. But now, Thomas didn't feel like he could ask them. "They won't help me," he thought sadly. "They are too upset with me." Thomas felt helpless and alone. Martha, the wise farmer, saw that Thomas was struggling. Even though she knew he had been selfish, she still cared about him. One evening, Martha came to Thomas's farm. She saw him sitting near his sick cow, looking worried. "Hello, Thomas," she said kindly. Thomas looked up. He was surprised to see Martha. "Hello, Martha," he said quietly. Martha sat down beside him. "I can see that you're having a hard time," she said. Thomas nodded. "My cow is sick, and my crops aren't doing well," he admitted. "I don't know what to do." Martha placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thomas," she said, "we all have difficult times. That's why we need to work together. When we help each other, we all do better." Thomas looked at Martha, feeling tears in his eyes. "But I've been selfish," he said. "I took more water than I needed. Now the other farmers are upset with me. I don't know how to fix it." Martha smiled gently. "The first step is to admit your mistake. Then, you can try to make it right. The others will forgive you, Thomas. They know you are a good man." After Martha left, Thomas sat quietly and thought about her words. He looked around at his lonely farm. He remembered how happy he had been when the farmers worked together and supported each other. He realized that being selfish had not made him happy. Instead, it had made him lonely and stressed. Thomas stood up and decided to change. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he wanted to make things right. Chapter 5. Making Things Right. Thomas sat on a wooden bench outside his small house. He looked at his farm and thought about everything Martha had said. He knew she was right. He had been selfish. His actions had hurt the other farmers. "I need to make things right," Thomas said to himself, but the thought of apologizing made him nervous. He felt ashamed of what he had done. What if the farmers didn't forgive him? Even though he was scared, Thomas decided he had to try. He wanted to fix his mistake and be part of the friendly village again. The next morning, Thomas walked to George's farm. George was working near his tomato plants. "Good morning, George," Thomas said, his voice a little shaky. George looked up. "Good morning, Thomas," he said. His tone was polite, but not warm. Thomas took a deep breath. "George, I want to say I'm sorry," he began. "I've been taking more water than I should. I know this made things harder for you and the others. I was wrong, and I feel bad about it." George was surprised. He didn't expect Thomas to apologize. For a moment, George didn't say anything. Then he nodded. "I appreciate your apology, Thomas," he said. "I was upset, but I understand. We all make mistakes." Thomas felt a small sense of relief. "Thank you, George," he said. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." After talking to George, Thomas felt a little braver. He decided to visit the other farmers one by one. At each farm, he knocked on the door or called out to the farmer. He explained that he was sorry for taking more water and for being selfish. Some farmers, like George, forgave him quickly. They appreciated his honesty and his effort to make things right. Others were slower to forgive. "It hurt us when you did that, Thomas," one farmer said. "It will take some time for me to trust you again." Thomas understood. He didn't try to rush them. He simply promised to do better in the future. With every apology, Thomas felt lighter. The heavy guilt he had been carrying started to fade. He noticed something else too. The farmers were beginning to smile at him again. Some even invited him to sit and talk for a while. For the first time in weeks, Thomas felt hope. He realized that making things right was not just about saying sorry. It was about showing through his actions that he cared about the others. After apologizing to everyone, Thomas had an idea. He called a meeting with the farmers at the well. "I have a plan," he said. "Let's create a schedule for using the well. This way, everyone gets a fair amount of water." The farmers listened carefully. "We can divide the time evenly," Thomas continued, "and if someone needs extra water one day, they can ask the group for help." The farmers looked at each other and nodded. They liked Thomas's idea. "That sounds fair," George said. "Yes, let's try it," Martha added. Together, the farmers created a schedule and agreed to follow it. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt proud. He had made a mistake, but now he was helping to solve the problem. Chapter 6: The Return of Harmony. The farmers started using the well fairly again. Every morning, they followed the new schedule that Thomas had suggested. Each farmer took their turn to pull up water. They only took as much as they needed, making sure there was enough for everyone. When someone struggled with the heavy buckets, others stepped in to help. The farmers laughed and chatted as they worked together. The atmosphere in the village changed. The arguments and worry were gone. Cooperation and kindness returned to the small community. Thomas watched this with a smile. He was happy to see the farmers working together again. One day, one of Thomas's cows became very sick. The cow lay on the ground, breathing heavily. Thomas was worried. Before, he would have been too proud to ask for help, but now, he knew he could rely on his neighbors. Thomas went to Martha first. "Martha, my cow is sick," he said. "Do you know what I should do?" Martha nodded. "I've seen this before," she said. "Let me come and take a look." Martha and a few other farmers came to Thomas's farm. They brought herbs and medicines for the cow. One farmer showed Thomas how to make a special drink for the cow to help it feel better. Within a few days, the cow began to recover. Thomas was touched by the farmer's kindness. "Thank you," he said. "I couldn't have done this without you." With the well water shared fairly, the farmers worked hard on their fields. They watered their crops regularly and helped each other with planting and harvesting. Soon, the village fields were full of healthy plants. The tomatoes were red and ripe. The corn grew tall and strong. The carrots were sweet and crunchy. Thomas looked at his farm and felt proud. His crops were thriving too. He knew it was because the farmers had worked together. Thomas was no longer lonely. The other farmers talked to him again, and he felt like part of the village. In the evenings, they sat together outside their homes, talking and laughing. Thomas enjoyed their company. He realized that being part of a community was more important than having extra water or crops. Thomas enjoyed their company. He realized that being part of a community was more important than having extra water or crops. He felt a sense of peace and happiness that he hadn't felt in a long time. At the end of the season, the farmers decided to celebrate. They planned a small feast to enjoy their good harvest. Each farmer brought food to share. There were fresh vegetables, bread, and even some sweet treats. The farmers sat together under a big tree. They ate, talked, and laughed. Children ran around, playing games and giggling. Thomas looked around at his neighbors and smiled. "I'm so lucky to live here," he thought. As the sun set, the farmers sang songs and told stories. The village felt warm and happy. Thomas silently thanked Martha and the other farmers. He was grateful for their forgiveness and kindness. He promised himself to always be a good and fair neighbor. Chapter 7. The Lesson Learned. This story teaches us an important lesson. Sharing makes life better for everyone. When the farmers shared the well, all the crops grew, and everyone had enough water. When people work together, they can solve big problems. If Thomas had kept being selfish, the village might have struggled. But because he chose to share, the village became happy and successful again. Kindness is very powerful. When Thomas's cow was sick, the other farmers helped him. They didn't have to, but they chose to be kind. Being part of a community means helping each other. When we help others, we also feel good inside. And when we need help, others will be there for us too. At first, Thomas thought being selfish would make him happy, but it didn't. When Thomas took more water than he needed, he felt guilty. He worried about what others thought of him. He felt lonely because the other farmers stopped talking to him. Selfishness might seem like a good idea at first, but it always brings bad feelings like guilt and sadness. Thomas changed. He realized that being selfish hurt both himself and others. He decided to apologize to the farmers and share the water fairly. This was not easy for him, but it was the right thing to do. Thomas became kind and cooperative. He worked with the other farmers and felt happy again. In the end, the village became a peaceful and happy place. The farmers helped each other, and their crops grew strong. The well, which had once caused problems, became a symbol of sharing and unity. Thomas looked at the well one evening and smiled. He remembered how far he and the village had come. He knew he was part of something special. This is the lesson of the story. When we share, help others, and work together, everyone can be happy.